good afternoon to you. I'm Merv Wyeth and I'm Secretary to APM Benefits Management Specific Interest Group, that's the SIG. Welcome to the webinar, and it's brought to you by the SIG today. Today's presentation marks the fourth in our series of APM Strengthen Your Knowledge campaign, specifically for effective benefits management. Last November, we kicked off with webinars which we organised with the Infrastructure and Projects Authority about the Guide to Benefits Management in Major Projects. You can read all about that, and the very important Project Delivery Capability Framework. And again, that's available free online. In December, you may have attended our Introduction to Benefits Management webinar by Judge Matharu, and today we move into Valuing Benefits. So we're on a roll, and we've got some more to come shortly. Our topic today, Valuing Benefits. It's a hot topic, or is it a can of worms? You may have seen the image in Tim's article on the APM community blog. We'll provide you with the link to that. But it's well worth a read, and we've also got a discussion going in APM's official LinkedIn group, so check this out. Let's move on and find out a bit about you. So first of all, we'd like to know which age group you're in, so a little bit of demographics about our audience. That's quite interesting. It will be fairly similar, I suspect, to the data we had on our last webinar when we did this. Are you a member of APM? If yes, and at what level? And again, if you're not a member of the APM yet, we're delighted that you've been able to join us, and do pick up later on. So you can see how that's working through. What type of project-related role do you typically perform? Interestingly enough, there seems to be a lot more in what we would say was the benefits camp, that business analysis and change specialist group are on this webinar, so it's great to see you. This is one of the word clouds. It's interesting to see how it builds, but clearly project managers prevail. There's a good follow on them from program managers, but you can take a look at that later to see what people's roles are. The primary sector that you're actually in, this is going to be really interesting, I think, to Tim, as he picks up on this later on and begins to understand how SROI might play into the different sectors. So we can see government and construction come through strongly there. Next is which statement best describes your organisation. Publicly funded projects, privately funded projects, delivering both public and privately, or don't deliver projects at all. And there we can see a fair mix. And in fact, very, very few of you don't deliver projects at all. So means the webinar is going to be very relevant to you. And then we move into the value component of this survey. I know about cost-benefit analysis, and clearly we can see 3/4 of you know about cost-benefit analysis. I know about social return on investment. We'd expect to see less, and it seems to be reversed. The trend shows about 1/4 or so know about social return on investment. We come to usage, use cost-benefit analysis. There we've got a 50-50 split. Incidentally, we're getting good numbers voting, so thank you for that. I've used social return on investment, a lot smaller that number, 11% at the moment. And here we've got a bit of fun, but I do think it's somehow relevant. What would you bring to a desert island? Interesting. I don't know if I dare comment on that, but you can see how the knife and the significant others prevail. Not related, I don't think. Okay, so that completes that part of the survey. We'll return to that a little bit later in our webinar. So next, let me introduce the topic and our speaker to you. We've called this, are all benefits equal, or are some more equal than others? And that is a misquote from Animal Farm. I'm sure you'll recognize it. In this Valuing Benefits webinar, we're going to consider different perspectives and techniques for valuing benefits. Tim, who is our speaker, he runs a social value consultancy that helps projects and organizations define and deliver their purpose. He started his career in economic development and regeneration in 2000, supporting social enterprise in Yorkshire. And that's from where he joins us today. Tim is a co-author of the guide SROI, sponsored by UK Government Cabinet Office, and a member of the Social Value International Methodology Committee. So welcome to Tim. I'm now going to hand you over to him.
Good afternoon, everyone. There's that picture of me doing my Usain Bolt impression again. Just to add a little bit more to Merv's introduction, which I thank him for. I'm not a project or program manager. So although background in European funding and economic development, 15, 20 years ago, I did manage projects, I wouldn't pretend at all to be an up-to-date project manager or professional in the way that many of you are. I say that as an apology that I may not be using the language of benefits or value in the same way that you do, but hopefully that offers a perspective. The other thing I think to add to that is that this is only going to be an introduction, and that from my perspective, I do aim to open that can of worms a bit. So for those of you that have some experience of cost-benefit analysis, I'm going to make some sweeping generalizations about cost-benefit analysis and indeed about SROI. And I'm sticking that in now, partly to cover myself so that if I offend you and I have a question at the end, I can say that I meant to do that, but also to raise that now that I'm not a project management professional. And so there may be some different perspectives and challenges in here. I want to talk about purpose. We'll look at some approaches. We've mentioned two already. We'll cover briefly the things in the little article that I wrote, but I want to talk more in this 45 minutes or so about valuation techniques and introduce you to some of those. It is just going to be an introduction in 45 minutes or so. I'm not going to cover a whole theory of valuation and introduction to all the techniques and leave you confident to go away and start valuing using all those techniques. It is obviously only going to be an introduction to the subject. In exploring how, we won't get anywhere without exploring why. I think the subject and the challenges are in some ways a circular debate. And my presentation is going to be circular. We will keep coming back to the central tenet of my belief about valuing things, and particularly social value, that it's not defined well enough, and so our results of valuation exercises don't lead to informed decisions. They're not useful. They're not often fit for purpose because we're not clear on the purpose. And so this will keep coming up as we go through and look at some examples and explore how it will only make sense in the context of why. So I think about different types of value to begin with, and I titled the little article we wrote, "What type of value are we trying to capture?" And one of the challenges here, particularly when we start thinking about social benefits, is defining them and knowing what they are. If you want to try and measure it or measure the value of it, then we first need to be clear what it is. And this is in valuation particularly a challenge. I've put the word value here behind 5 other words. There's lots of other things you could put in there. These are some particular ones that I think society has got some experience of, has taken some perspectives, and to some degree we do. They're in order, I think, roughly, of how society has evolved to account for and practice valuation of these things. Another way of presenting these, instead of the word value, is to talk about changes. Changes to finances, changes to the economy, or changes to society. So I think they're in a rough kind of chronological order. We've been accounting for changes in finances for hundreds of years now, depending how far you go back to when we actually started doing it. If you think about trading and transactions, you could go back beyond that. We now have that as a whole social construct. There's a profession, perhaps even more than one profession related to it, governance, and up until a point, it works. It's not perfect. There are challenges within the profession and the discipline. There are debates about how to do it, and it doesn't always do a perfect job for society. But we kind of know what it is and what it does. Beyond that, then, we've recognized it doesn't capture everything. And there are some things we want to know about that society has decided are good for it that we also want to try and understand or value in equal terms. Changes to an economy that don't appear on the balance sheet for a particular organization. fiscal value, possibly just thinking about tax, but also I widen that to think about cost savings or potential reduction in resources and demands on public systems that we might be interested to understand, possibly as a proxy for being a good thing for society as a whole. And more recently, to those things we've added, wanting to understand our transactions in the environment, or the value we create or destroy for the planet, and social value. Different reasons for doing those. It could be that we think all organisations and entities should be accountable to society, not just for their financial transactions, but for their environmental and social, in which case it's a statutory obligation and a compliance issue. And I think that's a good thing. But it might also be internally, if you think about financial accounting and its use internally as management accounts, very necessary information and data to drive financial performance. So if in your role, your organisation, you have any environmental or social purpose, well, don't we equally need the environmental and social data and value in front of us to manage performance against those? If you're responsible for delivering benefits that you might consider environmental or social or economic, do you have the data you need to be able to manage those in the way that we have the data we need to manage finance? So I'm going to go to the end of that and play with some examples of social value for a couple of reasons. One, it's because that's where my experience and expertise is, and so I'm perhaps most qualified, if I'm qualified at all, to talk about it. But secondly, because I think not only is this list in chronological order, it's also in order of the resource that we put into it, the effort, the understanding. And so when we get to social value at the end, we haven't been doing it as long as financial accounting. We don't put the resource into it. The techniques aren't as good. It's not as well understood. So if we start there and we understand that, and we can see a way to valuing something that, let's say, dignity for older people as an example of a social benefit, then I think if we can crack that one, the things earlier in the list come a bit easier, and society's been doing them for longer. So I'm going to play around with some examples at that end of the scale. In doing so, we'll start thinking about different levels of rigor as well. And I'm going to show you different ways or introduce some techniques for valuing things that are suitable for valuing benefits, whatever our definition of a benefit is and whatever type of benefit or value it is. And we're going to go through those in a rough order of rigor. A little bit more about rigor in a minute. But first, when we're thinking about why, I want to jump into an example. This is an example of a service that's publicly funded to give vulnerable older people who are isolated both geographically and socially in the community advice about rights and allowances, so financial support and statutory allowances that they're entitled to. In this situation, the definition of the benefit has come from those older people. We have asked them a question about change as in an evaluation environment. As a result of being involved in this service, what's changed for you? And these older people report 3 benefits, and from their perspective, they report them all as positive. We go on to look at the quantity of those. We develop appropriate metrics and indicators to help us see not just the frequency and occurrence of these benefits, but perhaps we've also got some scales in there that enables us to see the magnitude of each of these. But are these equal in weight? Which of these is the most good? Are some of them more positive than others? And then we raise some interesting questions about perspective and value. Again, to reiterate, in this example, we're taking this from the perspective of the older people. In an evaluation, that is trying to understand the benefit to them. I'll come back to why we might do that in a moment. If I add then the values that these service users, these end users have put on this, it changes our view of this, the presentation and the story. If we multiply simply the quantity by the value, you see the isolation on the bottom row turns out to stand out quite a lot more than the other two. Even though increased allowances, there was an equal quantity of that benefit. Now, in this situation, the increased allowances was the objective. The organisation delivering this project had a contract. Indeed, it had a performance payment. There was an outcome clause in the contract that linked the performance against a particular indicator for the allowances that people increased by being aware of them and filling the right bits of paper out with a bit of help. The contract also asked the delivery organisation here to monitor improved health as a cross-cutting theme for another department, but it wasn't contractual. It wasn't directly linked to the objectives of the funder. The funder did not ask or mention anything about isolation. So we've got three very different types of benefits here. One that is a target and objective. One that you might consider added value beyond the objectives, but of interest to the funder, and one that they were not aware of. They may still be interested in it. I think it's an interesting one, particularly at the moment in the UK, in the public service and in health and social services, where we now have a minister for loneliness that things like this are on the agenda. So we valued all these three, regardless of what type of benefit they are, in this case, in an equal and comparable way from the perspective of the stakeholder. I'm going to come back to how in a minute when we start introducing techniques. So at the moment, these are very deliberately numbers without any currency. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The point of this is I want you to see how it enables us to identify the significant weighting or value of one over another. It enables us to compare. When you don't get that, if we just started with the objectives, so the contract for this and the monitoring arrangements and the relationship in terms of data that we would have between project performance and the funder would only include the top two rows, and in most cases would not include the value. Take both of those out, and our existing data, it's not wrong, but it's answering a different question. How well are we achieving targets and objectives? How well are we performing against the funder's definition of success? Now, to deliver that project well, to manage it, and indeed keep your funder happy, you should do that. I'm not saying that's either wrong or a bad thing to do. I am saying it's a different question from knowing where you've created the most value. So let's dip into value a little bit more and start to think about how, and then we're going to come back to why again, as I suggested, a bit of a circular argument. There was a picture there of a nice shiny iPhone 10. How much would you be willing to pay for it? Yeah, that's fairly clear, isn't it? So most of us were willing to pay up to £500, but we don't know exactly where. We're in that bracket of 100 to 500. That was a very crude measure with some very broad bands in there. But I expect most of you know, or it won't take you long to find out on Google, an iPhone 10 costs you nearer £1,000. So there is a marketplace value for this, but most of us on this call do not recognize that value. Who's right? Who's wrong? Is the market wrong? So value gives us a different type of data. It is by definition subjective. Value is much closer to psychology if you want to explore it academically than it is any science, and it's that end of economics that we're thinking about that is about human behavior and how we view things, purely subjective. This will give you a different type of data and will give you some challenges. The first challenge is we aren't all going to agree on it in the same way that we might agree on metrics and indicators and whether we have achieved something. In that early example about isolation or health, these things can all be measured. We would normally, with those kind of things, set up some tests or criteria that have some kind of threshold that satisfy us for the amount of health or isolation that is acceptable, and count the number of people that pass that threshold. You can do that with valuation. Again, we could set a threshold in the way that we did there with some very broad categories and go, well, half of us are willing to pay at least more than £100 for this. But yet the marketplace value is still 10 times that. If you ask my teenage daughters the value of that phone, well, it's probably even more than the marketplace value, only it's probably my money they wanted to spend on it. Then we have another interesting perspective that it's not just varied data that we need to deal with, but that different audiences have different perspectives on the value of things. The value to the person who has to pay for it may not be the value to the person who benefits from it. My daughters will put a priceless value on having the latest iPhone. If it was their money, if they had it, would they spend it? Probably. But it highlights the different values between me paying for it. When we translate that into our scenarios of managing projects, why is a benefit good? Because an organization is trying to achieve an objective, because a policy has been agreed elsewhere, in which case that value, that perspective may come from wanting to answer that question against the objectives and that policy, which is a completely different perspective of value to the end user who may actually be experiencing it. In our example about health and isolation, for example, paid for by a local authority, the purpose of that may be to reduce costs on a system that is really struggling with resources and demand at the moment. Those values from the perspective of that decision and those organizations are very different from the end user's value. So there's at least two challenges in here. Firstly, dealing with this variable data that isn't as simple as dealing with indicators and metrics when we're counting quantities or occurrences of things. And secondly, these changes in audience. We'll just take this story a little bit further and then come back to talk about some different purposes. In this example, we'll introduce the simplest way of valuing things, and that's simply to ask people to rank things. We could do that in this situation by asking the older people to put things in order, first, second, and third, out of a choice of health, allowances, and isolation, and then just see which one comes out top. That is valuation. It's qualitative, not quantitative valuation, but it is preferences, priorities. The next level up from that is where we want to go beyond that, because we don't know the distance between first and second and third. It's not necessarily a linear scale. And so we'd want to weight that in some way. In this example, perhaps we had 23 older people on this project, and they were each given 5 coins and asked, if you could spend these 5 coins on health, allowances, and isolation, how would you allocate them? Some people put all 5 on isolation, some people put most on isolation and a bit here or there, but we could use those kind of methods of allocation, and indeed these kind of payment techniques are possible to do and set up with large samples. So if 23 people had 5 coins, they may have valued these outcomes in that very simple way. Again, qualitative, but within the stakeholder group expresses a relative value. Now there's other things we can do with this. We could translate this into money, slightly cheating with this one, but we know the financial value of the middle one. Allowances is already valued for us. So the benefits and allowances and the increase in that this project was trying to make sure people got everything they were entitled to, we know the average of these 23 people on this project was £100 each in a year. It's then a simple pro rata that if that relates to their relative value that we had on some scale, or in this case, weighting with a few coins was 10, we can do that pro rata. And what we've done there is we've anchored those relative values to one valuation that we know, that we have the source for, and it's a logical pro rata to go, I can now see then the financial value, or put a valuation on those other benefits, turned those total numbers now into financial numbers, which would then enable me to start making comparisons with costs. At a very simple level, we have just valued those benefits. That might be too simple for you though, so let's have a think about some of the challenges there. Firstly, technically, why put a value on things? There are sometimes moral obligations to this, but the technical evolution of valuation techniques tends to come from these two things. Firstly, it's a desire to include in decision making things that are normally excluded because they don't have a financial value, or they're not included in existing valuation techniques. If you're already doing a lot of economic and environmental accounting, you may already be doing that bit. It may be social benefits that are the missing bit. It may be you are only currently including financial value, in which case the missing bit from the decision may be both environmental, economic and social. The other technical reason is when we go beyond one stakeholder group in the way we just had there, where we are only looking at the relative value within the older people experiencing that project. If I want to compare that with costs, or I want to compare it with perhaps the family of those people, or maybe the project had some volunteer input. Maybe I also want to understand how society at large, or the residents and the community around that project valued it, what we call a non-use value. Then I have challenges as to these relative scales, as to whether this one scale is comparable, whether one person's weighting is directly comparable with another, and I need a common unit. Those are the technical reasons why. There can also be lots of different decisions, motivations and drivers though, that lead us not technically to look for a solution to this, but for other reasons, to want to know the value of benefits. What are yours, I wonder? I'm going to hand over to Merv again. Some of you will have answered that question. If not, there's another question in the Mentimeter poll to see if there's a primary motivation for you for wanting to value benefits.
What purpose for valuing benefits would be most useful to you? And you can see that we've already got over 150 people voted out of the 340 or so on the call.
Brilliant.
About a third justifying funding and investment, 15% promote or publicise benefits better, and then about a half deliver benefits that meet end user priorities.
Excellent. So I'm really encouraged by that, because a lot of the challenges I find in the work I do is that many of the motivations for wanting to have a value is that there is some power in that pound sign to justify a funding or a policy decision, which inevitably is always in favour of an organisation or an activity in one way or another, or to promote. If it is just those two, there is a risk that our motivation is very clearly biased in one direction to produce a positive number. And if by definition value is subjective, and valuation of things like social benefits is relatively new, there is scope for some manoeuvre with those figures, and so some challenges. If, however, our primary purpose in valuation is to understand the relative value or weightings of benefits, so that we focus our resources on managing and delivering things in that way to maximize value for both end users and objectives and funders, well, then does it actually matter how precise the answer is? If we're not looking for precise comparisons with cost or comparability between projects, it's simply about understanding relative priorities, then maybe the little exercise I just showed you before is as far as we need to go. Generally, I find the further away you go from the activity in terms of those responsible for delivering it and making decisions about it, the greater the need for rigor. The more the audience won't accept weaknesses in the data and want a more precise or accurate figure. Internally, we work a lot more with rough figures. We do it in our management accounts. The further away you go from the budget holder, the more precise the answer or the accurate figure is required for decision makers. And as you move outside of an organization, that's certainly true with valuations, evaluation data, and other things where we seek to influence other people's decisions. So some sweeping generalizations here that cost-benefit analysis is generally practiced, although in theory it doesn't have to be. It is generally practiced more at the end of, as the title suggests, comparing the value of the benefits with the value of the costs to make good investment decisions. It's proving the worth of something. In an evaluation context, you would hope that leads to improving, but in reality, it's not used during delivery as a management tool. Social return on investment at the other end of the spectrum is designed more to try and encourage these lower rigor, practical, I would call them management information techniques that enable us to add value and see how one benefit may be more important than another to end users, to prioritize those in the way that we've looked at. In theory, cost-benefit analysis can be done at a very low level of rigor in the same way. In theory, social return on investment can include all of these purposes. We all tend to monitor our objectives. The difference then with some of these terms, I would say, in evaluation, is that instead of starting with our objectives, good evaluation will go beyond and look at the whole activity to identify benefits, not just those intended. When we start to get into valuation, and if you wanted a definition, social return on investment specifically, it would go beyond identifying the added benefits, the wider benefits, however you might describe them, into a framework that looks for each of them at the quantity, measure and evidence of each benefit, its duration, the value that we're talking about in this webinar, but also the causality. Both cost-benefit analysis and social return on investment should include good causality information, thinking about control groups and other sources of data that enable us not just to identify the benefit and the value, but how much of that is actually because of the activity we're responsible for. I could very easily fall into a trap to talk about social return on investment for the rest of this session, but I'm going to leave that one there for the moment and return to our subject. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development, whose slide I've pinched here, also talk about reasons for valuing what they call social capital. And I recommend this to you. They put this quite helpfully on a scale where on the left-hand side, reasons for including in private sector and corporate decisions social capital or social value or benefits. On the left-hand side, a slightly more cynical view of the world about compliance and managing risk. Not wanting to be the next corporate that ends up on the front page for not appearing to be responsible for society. To opportunities on the right-hand side about standing apart from the crowd by being ethical, responsible, and understanding customers and their needs better and contributing to society. I recommend this document to you. This is from the Social Capital Protocol. Very helpful in understanding those uses as a way into it in corporate decision making. But I think also an awful lot to learn for those of you in the public sector as well from some of these things. It's a really nicely written guide and does go on to some of the things I'm going to cover in terms of an introduction to valuation techniques. Indeed, it includes more than I can include in this session. I want to go back on to how and start to build up the rigor a bit. I borrowed a slide here from the webinar that Judge did, Merv mentioned on benefits mapping, which I recommend to you. in it, he talked about prioritization. In this example, the blue enablers are things that Judge might do in order to get to the yellow objective of reducing his CO2 footprint, with benefits in green as to how you might prioritize those. And you might prioritize them in order to consider the costs and maximize delivery of them. He suggested that we look at, if they're in a chain like this, the influence or contribution of each benefit on the right-hand side of the objective. And if we do that in percentage terms, we can see a judgment here that the top one is having most of the influence or contribution. Of that 50% on the top one, can we attribute that to the bits in the chain before it, and so on. And if we do that in percentage terms for each one and we allocated some points, so here we're talking about ranking and weighting and allocating again, qualitative valuation. 1,000 points that we give to achieving the objective, well, follow those percentages back and we can allocate these points until we arrive at the total points that would be allocated to each enabler. We can then make some decisions then about the costs of each enabler and the value, the relative, in this case, value that each creates in its influence and contribution to achieving the objective. And I think there's a very natural progression from here if you have benefits map like this into understanding value, starting here with these weightings and what Judge calls prioritization. But I'm going to add a couple of things to this. Firstly, where do those numbers come from? Who allocates those figures about the influence and contribution? If these are social benefits, it's not a massive leap forward to get input from end users to do that, to reflect their preferences. If your purpose is allocating costs and meeting priorities for funders and investors, then we'd have a conversation with them about their priorities. I think the other thing to say on this is when we're thinking about benefits, that there almost certainly will be more benefits and objectives, that there won't just be a single one. Then we have that challenge between comparing relative scales like this one with another, and then we may introduce financial valuation again. Also, we may have benefits outside of those that lead to the objectives, again, including those unintended and wanting to understand the relative or financial value of those. So let's move those on to look at a bit more rigor then of valuation techniques that include monetization or putting a financial value on things. The most obvious techniques for monetized valuation are those that have cost or income already included. So in that example we looked at earlier, we already knew and understood the financial value of the allowances, partly cheating as an example, but it enabled me to show you that idea of anchoring. If we had in my example health, isolation and dignity, and we didn't know the cost or income implications of any of those, then the first thing might be that we're looking at these so-called value-based methods to find the value of some of those. Again, we could attach an anchor to them and go from there, or we could value them all separately. Traditionally, the valuation techniques used in economics academically, particularly in health economics, and in cost-benefit analysis are what are called the preference techniques. There's a little hierarchy or taxonomy here. We'll have a quick look at a type of revealed preference, a type of stated preference, and more recently, in the last 10 years or so, out of the literature on the pros and cons of these two mutually exclusive techniques, neither of which is right or wrong, they're different, a new contemporary approach in the academic and economic literature has emerged called Wellbeing valuation based on life satisfaction data. Very quick look at a few of these. Many of these techniques rely on marketplace values. The theory behind this is that in a marketplace where someone is trying to make profit, goods and services are sold at the price which is higher than cost. These references, these marketplace values, are only valid when that is true. In a distorted market, a public sector cost, for example, is not a price in this sense. Where there is lots of supply and demand and choice in these marketplaces, the value of the good to us, its utility in economic terms, gets forced very close to the price. If we value it less than the price, no transaction takes place, the supplier does not make a profit. If value is way above price, the supplier is losing profit. And so again, where there's lots of supply and demand and choice, value needs to sit just above price to be balanced in that marketplace for value for the consumer, the customer, and the provider or the supplier. So where that's true, price is then a good indication of value. And this is used in many techniques. Have a quick look at an example of a revealed technique. I've got a few slides here which I've taken from an example that's a worked example in the Guide to Social Return on Investment that Merv mentioned earlier that we wrote coming up for 10 years ago now for UK government, and an example in there that I wrote about a little luncheon club. One of the things that older people reported was improved or maintained independence as a benefit for them as a result of this activity, whose primary objective was to give them a meal. Now, there's no market for something like independence. It doesn't have a cost or income already associated to it for that individual, and so we look for something else. This is a type of revealed preference or alternative spend, often called a financial proxy. And if we get the match right between the marketplace that this individual, this end user accesses, then the price they would pay, providing this is a private sector marketplace, for an alternative that achieves the same benefit for them that in a parallel universe they were receiving from a luncheon club for free, reveals the value of that benefit to them. And so we can see ways of things that marketplaces don't value, that we struggle to include on an equal footing with things that do have financial values, a way of valuing that. And you could carry on with that and look for ways of valuing dignity and other things that those people might have experienced and reported as a benefit in an evaluation scenario. Also in this example, the older people were reporting maintaining their dignity. In this case, it was because of some exercise they did while they were at the luncheon club that resulted in a few of them having fewer falls during the period. A bit harder to find in this example a good match of what we call a financial proxy, a type of revealed preference technique for dignity. Instead, a very simple, user-friendly, stated preference technique. We asked these older people what things they would like if we were going to buy them some stuff. And I like playing this game. It tends to get beyond a lot of the challenges technically of valuation techniques and really get to the heart of understanding someone's preferences. You can do it with older people. I've done it with people with moderate to severe learning disabilities and difficulties. It's very easy to do with kids. Kids make these decisions much quicker than we do. A list of things here. Ask people to put them in order. You can do this in a focus group, get some really healthy discussion going on which thing would you put at the top, which one are you not bothered. There are some rules to this which we don't have time to go through now to get good, precise data out of it, but I can share it with you just with a few slides so you get the principle of it. One of the things on this list does not have a marketplace value. The others are regularly bought and sold in marketplaces where there's lots of choice and supply and demand that gives us a strong chance that the price of those things in those marketplaces, if the marketplace is indeed one that those people would access, indicates their value for those that have a transaction and buy that thing. So you can play that game. I just call it a value game. There's lots of things I'm referring to in this webinar that we'll try and give you a list of things later. This one's called the value game, and there's an online resource called Value Game Online. If we put some of the marketplace values to that, we can come to a conclusion on the relative value relative to marketplace values that these people put dignity. And so in this example, somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000. In reality, to be prudent, I would use a value of at least 4,300. So a type there of simple, low rigor, revealed preference firstly, and then secondly in this example, stated preference technique. At higher levels of rigor, contingent valuation and willingness to pay is particularly popular in cost-benefit analysis and economics. An example here from where it's practiced a lot in health economics, and something here that perhaps you'd think couldn't be valued. The willingness to pay of someone to avoid or prevent getting a disease. Now, I'm not going to read this one out or explain it to you other than to highlight in red there the value and the relatively tight, precise value that is possible if some of the academic disciplines and rigor are applied to this. The theory behind it is the same, but the practice and the known challenges, the psychology and the bias in valuation can be dealt with to get more precise, credible, reliable answers. In this case, this text is taken from an academic journal. An example here of a willingness to pay question. It's not a complete question, but this is one I did last year, where we were looking to understand the civic pride, the literacy, and the inclusion and diversity benefits of a festival. And this including the civic pride benefits for residents in the city where the festival was delivered who didn't go to the festival itself, a non-use value. A good willingness to pay question gets constructed to avoid known biases. There's a long list of them. Comes psychology. You're getting the person to a position where they believe the answer they give to the question will influence a decision, and so their value that is going to make a difference and is more realistic and honest. That's what the word contingent means in contingent valuation. Lots you can read around that, lots of examples. We're at the other end now in terms of rigor. Needs more work, some experience, perhaps some expertise. Beyond willingness to pay, becoming more popular now is discrete choice experiments. Again, practiced mostly within health economics, where with some software we could run an experiment and ask these 4 questions. Which of these would you prefer? And within this data, we have identified some attributes that we want to value. A navigation system, metallic paint, color, interior, and price. And with a big enough sample and with some statistical analysis, a discrete choice experiment will enable you from this data to isolate how much extra price are people willing to pay who want a white rather than a blue car, metallic paint rather than not, with or without GPS. Another technique, but this one builds on willingness to pay. Willingness to pay traditionally values the whole. This is attempting to try and also understand attributes of the whole. And one more just to finish and tempt you with finally, and that's to use life satisfaction data on what's called well-being valuation. There's a lot of data, particularly in the UK, but internationally now, where an open, recognized, and commonly used measure now of happiness or well-being, academically called life satisfaction, is asked on a 7-point subjective scale in surveys. Often in census type survey. In the UK, we'll find this in the Office of National Statistics in several places. That means a lot of the data is good quality, it's subjective, and the question hasn't been asked because there's a particular threat of either something being removed or provided. It reduces a lot of the biases. If in this data we know that someone living in a safe area compared with last year, reporting that change, also has a 1-point increase on this 7-point scale in their life satisfaction, this would be a correlation in the data, all other things being equal. And we also know that someone who has an increase in £2,000 income in that year reports the same 1 point increase in their life satisfaction, then notionally, the value of living in a safe area and a change in that in a year is worth £2,000 worth of income. These values becoming very useful if you're working with general national average populations. Lots of sources for these kind of things of both willingness to pay and these well-being valuations. If you are designing activities, if you are managing activities for national average populations, there's some good news in that you may not need to do these valuation exercises. These references may already be there. The challenge comes though if your end users are not national average. Be careful with these sources and be careful if you can't repeat them yourselves. It's actually better to have a much lower rigor type of valuation thing that we had at the start to understand the value of the benefits to your end users. These sources can also be used in the way I talked earlier about anchoring, whether one of these might be good enough to then give us a pro rata to understand either in a benefits mapping prioritizing exercise or a relative scale. But be careful about picking different sources of values and adding them together if they are not comparable. An example here from a famous sign in California. Different valuation techniques are known to have biases. Values are by definition subjective and may have been valued for particular reasons. So be really careful about using mixed combinations of other people's valuations to compare one benefit with another. Be careful also with those averages that you may have increased the average benefit for a population or a group you're working with. But have we understood that there are still within that some people who are always above and always below the average? Is the information we're using, which might be a really good proxy for the average value something puts on it, completely applicable to the population of the end users that we're working with? If we're working with people who are below average, vulnerable, and have the greatest needs in society, be careful about using data about average people to apply to them. I had a couple of examples I was going to share with you and some interesting stories attached to them, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock and realise I'm running out of time, so apologies, I'm going to skip those, but they are in the public domain. We can perhaps pop some references to those into the slides and the resources we share with you afterwards. So to finish and to hand back to you, Merv, with apologies for running over slightly, 3 things to think about. Be clear, not just on whose value and the definition of the value you are trying to capture and measure, but I think that opens a can of worms potentially about being clear about whose benefit it is in the first place. But if you are clear on that, it should give you an easy way into valuation techniques. Get the level of rigor right, get the valuation technique and the perspective right for the audience. And then you can pitch hopefully a proportionate level of work to value something that is good enough to make the decision. Be clear on those decisions and perspectives, and then you have a chance of producing effective, fit for purpose valuations.
That was fantastic. I can see that you are displaying your contact details on there, so I'm sure you would encourage people to get in touch with you by all manner of means. Thank you very much for that. We are, in fact, out of time pretty much. And just a quick update, we've had about 350 of you have stayed with us throughout, so that's brilliant. Many of you have been voting as we've gone through. You can download copies of those slides and look at them at your leisure. So just coming back to some parish notices, the Programme Management Conference that you've heard quite a lot about really is worth attending. It represents great value, so do come along to that if you are able. And then we've got our next webinar, which will be the 22nd of February, so it's the 5th in our series. is with Phil Driver from New Zealand. A tremendous sacrifice to himself. It'll be 1:30 in the morning when he speaks to us on validating strategies. You can read all about validated strategies at his website, openstrategies.com. And a heads up, he will be visiting the UK for 2 weeks in May. So we're looking at what sort of physical events we can organise with Phil. But do come along to our webinar on the 22nd. And finally, we have put this last question in there. What have you learned from this webinar? We really do advocate reflective learning. So we wanted you to look at some of the materials that will be available later on and fill this in. So I think that's pretty much it. I want to thank you again, Tim. That was an absolutely fantastic webinar. Goodbye.